David had been looking forward to his business trip for weeks. He had an important meeting scheduled, and everything seemed to be falling into place. After a busy few months at work, a quiet flight with some time to relax seemed like the perfect way to prepare. He walked onto the plane, flashing his boarding pass to the gate agent. It was a typical business class seat for a flight from New York to Chicago, the kind he was used to, and David was eager to get settled. He found his seat in the first class section and placed his bag in the overhead compartment. Everything was going smoothly. He sat down, made himself comfortable, and began to organize his materials for the meeting. Soon after takeoff, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching his row. The flight attendant, a woman in her mid-30s with short blonde hair, was walking down the aisle, checking on passengers. She stopped by David's seat and looked at him with a hint of confusion on her face. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone sharp, "but I think you're in the wrong seat." David looked up, a little surprised. "No, I'm in the right seat," he said, pointing to his boarding pass and the seat number on the ticket. "This is 1A. The flight attendant frowned, not looking at the boarding pass. "No, sir, you're not supposed to be in this seat. Someone else is assigned to this seat," she insisted. David, who had traveled on this airline many times before, found this situation a little odd. "I'm sure there's been a mistake," he said politely, "but I'm in the correct seat. I've checked my boarding pass twice." The flight attendant didn't seem to listen to his explanation. Instead, she shook her head and said, "Well, this seat is for a first-class passenger, and you shouldn't be sitting here. You need to move to your assigned seat." David felt a twinge of frustration. "This is my seat," he replied calmly, trying to keep the situation from escalating. But the flight attendant's expression hardened. "I don't have time for this," she said coldly, glancing around as if David were causing a scene. "You'll have to move now." David, now feeling uncomfortable, tried to explain again. "I don't think there's a mistake. I've flown on this airline before, and this is my assigned seat." But it didn't seem to matter. The flight attendant stood firmly in front of him, arms crossed, insisting that he move. A few passengers started to notice the exchange. Some glanced at David with sympathy, while others seemed uncomfortable. David wasn't sure whether to get up and argue further or to let it go. But with his important meeting ahead, he didn't want to create more of a scene. "Ma'am," David said, keeping his voice calm, "I'd be happy to speak with the supervisor if there's a misunderstanding." The flight attendant finally turned to walk away, but not before she muttered something under her breath. "It's just typical," she said quietly, though loud enough for David to hear. "People like him always think they can sit anywhere." David froze for a moment, the words stinging more than he expected. It wasn't just a mistake about a seat. It felt like something much worse, an unfair judgment based on who he was. He sat back in his seat, now unsure whether to confront the flight attendant further or to wait and speak with someone else. The moment lingered, and David couldn't shake the feeling that he had just been treated differently for reasons that had nothing to do with the seat. David sat in his seat, feeling a mixture of confusion and frustration. He was still shaken by the flight attendant's words. He had expected his flight to be relaxing, but instead, he felt like he was being treated unfairly. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. He had traveled often for work and had never faced anything like this before. The rest of the flight seemed to drag on. David couldn't focus on his work or even enjoy the in-flight entertainment. His thoughts kept returning to the encounter with the flight attendant. Why had she treated him this way? Was it just a mistake, or was there something more to it? He couldn't help but wonder if his race had something to do with it. He looked around the cabin, noticing the other passengers. Everyone else seemed to be minding their own business, but some of them were glancing at him. Was it just his imagination, or did they seem to be watching him more closely after the interaction with the flight attendant? The plane was halfway through its flight when the same flight attendant returned. She walked down the aisle with her trolley, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers. When she reached David's row, she stopped and looked at him briefly, her eyes scanning his face as if she was deciding whether to say something more. David could feel her gaze, but he didn't look up at her. Instead, he stared straight ahead, trying to remain calm and collected. He didn't want to escalate the situation further, especially since they were halfway through the flight. But then, something unexpected happened. The flight attendant bent down slightly and whispered just loud enough for David to hear, "You should know your place." David's heart sank as the words hit him. He had hoped the encounter was simply a misunderstanding, but it was becoming clearer that this was something more than just a seat mix-up. The words stung, and his initial shock turned into anger. He felt humiliated, disrespected, and hurt. But he knew that responding with anger wouldn't help. He had to keep his cool. David quietly reached for the call button above his seat. He pressed it gently, not knowing what to expect next. A few moments later, another flight attendant arrived. This one had a kind face and a more welcoming smile. "Yes, sir. How can I assist you?" she asked politely. David took a deep breath and calmly explained the situation. "I've been treated unfairly by the flight attendant, and I'd like to speak with a supervisor," he said, his voice steady. The new flight attendant seemed concerned and quickly nodded. "Of course, sir. Let me get the supervisor for you right away." Within minutes, a manager arrived at David's seat. She was a woman in her 40s, dressed in the same uniform as the flight attendants, but her expression was much more serious. "Good afternoon, sir. I understand there's an issue with your seating." David explained everything: how the first flight attendant had accused him of being in the wrong seat, how she had insisted he move, and the hurtful comment she had made. As he spoke, the manager's face grew more and more serious. She listened attentively, nodding as David finished telling the story. "I'm so sorry this happened," the manager said sincerely. "This is absolutely unacceptable, and I'm going to look into it immediately. You should never be treated this way, and I'll make sure it's addressed." David felt a small sense of relief. It was good to have someone take his complaint seriously, but it didn't erase what had happened. He still felt humiliated, and he still couldn't shake the feeling that the flight attendant had targeted him for reasons beyond a simple mistake. As the manager walked away, promising to investigate, David leaned back in his seat. He didn't know what would happen next, but he hoped that the situation would be resolved fairly. For now, all he could do was sit and wait. The rest of the flight passed by in a blur for David. Despite the manager's promise to look into the situation, he couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. The interaction with the flight attendant had left him unsettled, and he found it hard to focus on anything else. He looked around at the other passengers, wondering if any of them had noticed the confrontation. As the plane descended toward its destination, David couldn't help but replay the events in his mind. The way the flight attendant had treated him, the harshness in her tone, and the insult that followed. It all felt wrong. He had tried his best to stay calm and polite, but he had been treated like an outsider in a place where he had every right to be. When the plane landed, David gathered his things, feeling a little better knowing that the flight was over. He walked down the aisle, past rows of passengers who hadn't noticed the tension, their faces buried in their phones or books. But for David, the flight had been a reminder of something much bigger. It wasn't just about a seat mix-up. It was about the way people of color were often treated unfairly, whether they were in an airport, on an airplane, or just going about their everyday lives. As he made his way to the gate, he saw the manager again. She smiled at him and approached, her expression more serious than before. "Sir, I just wanted to let you know that we've addressed the issue with the flight attendant," she said. "She's been removed from her duties for the rest of the flight, and I've ensured that this won't happen again. We take matters like this very seriously." David nodded, appreciating the manager's quick action. "Thank you," he said. "I appreciate you taking the time to address this." The manager gave him a sympathetic look. "Of course, sir. I'm really sorry you had to experience that. It's not how we want our passengers to feel. If you ever have any concerns in the future, please don't hesitate to reach out." David felt a small sense of relief. At least something was being done about the situation. But as he walked toward baggage claim, the weight of the experience still lingered. He had been humiliated for no reason, other than the assumptions someone had made about him based on how he looked. It was a painful reminder of the discrimination that many people faced every day. When David finally got to his hotel, he sat down in the room and took a moment to gather his thoughts. His meeting was still the next day, and he knew he needed to be focused, but the events of the flight had left him shaken. He thought about what had happened and how, despite the apology from the manager, things needed to change. The problem wasn't just the actions of one flight attendant. It was a deeper issue that went beyond the airline. Discrimination and unfair treatment existed in many forms, and David knew that it was important to speak up, even if it was uncomfortable. The next morning, David decided to take action. He wrote an email to the airline's corporate office, detailing his experience. He explained how he had been treated unfairly and expressed his hope that the company would do more to train its staff on how to treat all passengers with respect, regardless of their background. David knew that one email wouldn't solve the problem, but he felt it was important to speak out. He hoped that by sharing his story, the airline would take the necessary steps to ensure that no one else would have to go through what he did. As he prepared for his meeting, David felt a sense of empowerment. The experience had been difficult, but it had also given him the chance to make a difference. He knew that he couldn't change everything on his own, but he could be a part of the change. And that, he realized, was the first step toward a better future for everyone. After sending the email to the airline, David went into his meeting feeling a little more at ease. He had done what he could to address the wrongs he had experienced, and now he could focus on the work ahead. The meeting itself went well. David was able to present his ideas clearly, and the business partners seemed impressed. He felt a sense of accomplishment as the meeting came to an end. But despite the success of his workday, David couldn't completely shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. The incident on the plane had left a mark on him, and he knew that it wasn't just about one flight attendant. The whole experience made him realize that he wasn't just dealing with an isolated incident. It was a reminder of the biases and judgments that existed in society. That evening, as David sat in his hotel room, his phone buzzed. It was an email notification from the airline's customer service department. David opened it, curious to see their response. The email started with an apology for his experience, but what caught his attention were the details that followed. The airline had thoroughly investigated the situation, and the flight attendant involved had been suspended pending further review. Additionally, the airline expressed a commitment to reviewing its training programs and working to make sure all employees treated passengers with fairness and respect. David felt a surge of relief as he read the email. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. The company had acknowledged the issue and was taking steps to prevent something like this from happening again. He felt proud that his voice had been heard, but he also knew that it wasn't just about getting an apology. It was about making real, lasting change. The next day, David woke up early and got ready for his flight back home. As he walked into the airport, he couldn't help but notice the bustling crowd, people coming and going, hurrying to their gates and checking in. The world around him felt normal, but he knew there was still work to be done to ensure that everyone, no matter their background, was treated with dignity and respect. David made sure to pass through security and head to his gate. The airport was busy, and there were a lot of people waiting to board flights. As he sat down in the waiting area, his mind kept returning to the encounter with the flight attendant. He knew that he had done the right thing by speaking up, but a small part of him wondered if his actions would really make a difference in the long run. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from his friend, James. James had heard about the situation from David's earlier messages and wanted to check in. "Hey man, how are you doing after everything? I heard the airline is taking action. I'm proud of you for standing up for what's right," James texted. David smiled at the message. It felt good to be supported by people who cared about him and his cause. "Thanks, James. "It's been a tough week, but I'm glad I spoke up. The airline is taking steps, and I just hope it helps in the long run." He felt a sense of closure after reading the message. Speaking out had been difficult, but it had been worth it. He knew that he couldn't stop here. There was more to be done. There were more people to help, more stories to tell, and more work to make sure that everyone, regardless of who they were, was treated fairly. As the boarding call for his flight echoed through the terminal, David stood up, ready to head back home. He knew that the journey for change would continue, but today he could hold his head high. He had taken a stand, and that was something he would never regret. David's flight back home was peaceful, a sharp contrast to the tension he had felt earlier. As the plane soared high above the clouds, David sat back in his seat, reflecting on everything that had happened over the past few days. He had taken action, and while he still felt the weight of the situation, he was proud of how he handled it. Standing up for himself had not only given him a sense of closure, but had also opened his eyes to the larger issues of fairness and respect in society. When he landed at the airport, David felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. He had a lot to catch up on, but he also felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the experience on the flight wasn't just about one flight attendant. It was a reminder of the importance of standing up against injustice, no matter where it happens. David walked through the airport, his mind focused on the next steps. He had received a response from the airline, and while he was glad they were taking action, he knew that change couldn't happen with just one conversation or one report. It required ongoing effort, not just from the companies and organizations, but from individuals like himself, who were willing to speak out and make a difference. When David arrived home, he was greeted by his family, who had been waiting for him. His wife, Claire, and their 2 kids, Ella and Liam, had missed him. As they sat down for dinner that night, David shared the details of the situation with them, telling them how the flight attendant had treated him and how he had addressed the issue with the airline. Claire listened intently, her face reflecting concern and pride. "I'm proud of you for standing up for what's right, David," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It's not easy to speak up, but it's the only way we can make change." David smiled at his family. "I didn't want to make a scene, but it was important. No one should ever feel disrespected because of who they are. I hope that by speaking up, things can be different for the next person who faces something like this." The conversation shifted to their plans for the weekend, but David's thoughts kept drifting back to what he had experienced. He knew he had done the right thing, but he also understood that the journey didn't end there. The issue wasn't just about a single flight. It was about creating an environment where people were treated equally, no matter their background. The next day, David received a call from the airline. It was the manager from his flight, the one who had apologized and assured him that the situation would be addressed. She thanked him again for bringing the issue to their attention and informed him that the company was implementing new measures to improve its customer service training. The flight attendant who had been involved in the incident had been retrained, and the airline was also reviewing its policies on how to handle passengers more equitably. David felt a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step in the right direction. He knew that this wasn't a one-time fix, but he was hopeful that it would help make a difference for future passengers. The airline's commitment to change was an important first step, and he felt encouraged that his voice had contributed to that. As he hung up the phone, David sat back in his chair, a sense of peace settling over him. He had taken action, and while the journey for fairness was far from over, he was proud of the change he had helped spark. He knew that if everyone stood up for what was right, together, they could create a better, more respectful world for all. A few weeks had passed since the incident on the flight, and life had slowly returned to normal for David. He had resumed his busy schedule, focusing on work and spending time with his family. However, the events of that day continued to linger in his mind. It wasn't just about what had happened on the plane. It was about the larger issue of fairness and the importance of standing up for oneself. One evening, As David sat with Claire after the kids had gone to bed, they talked about the experience. Claire could tell that the situation still weighed on David's mind. She had noticed that he seemed more determined lately, focused on making sure that his actions had a lasting impact. "David," Claire said gently, "I know this situation hasn't been easy, but I'm so proud of you. What you did took a lot of courage." David nodded, looking out the window as the evening sky turned dark. "It wasn't just about me, Claire. It's about everyone. People like us, we have to speak up when things aren't right. If we don't, nothing will ever change." Claire smiled, touching his hand. "I agree. You're making a difference, not just for us, but for the people who don't have the chance to speak out." David appreciated Claire's words. They meant a lot to him. But he knew that the work didn't stop with one phone call, one report, or one apology. There was still so much more to do. The next day, David decided to take action again. He wanted to make sure that the airline's new policies weren't just a temporary fix. He knew that for real change to happen, it needed to come from all sides: policy changes, education, and a shift in attitudes. David wrote a letter to the airline, thanking them for their efforts, but also urging them to continue their commitment to inclusivity. He suggested that they expand their training programs and make sure their employees were consistently evaluated on how they treated passengers. It was important. David believed that the airline not only fixed the immediate situation, but also made long-term changes that would positively affect everyone. He also took it upon himself to talk to other passengers who had experienced similar issues. He reached out to a few friends and colleagues, asking them to share their stories. His goal was to build a network of voices, people who could come together to ensure that fairness was a part of everyday life, in the air and on the ground. As the weeks passed, David began to notice a change in himself. The experience had shifted something within him. He was more vocal, more active in fighting for fairness and justice, and more aware of the challenges people faced daily. He realized that one person's voice, even if it seemed small, could start a ripple effect. That was the power of speaking up. David's efforts didn't go unnoticed. A few weeks later, he received another call from the airline's customer service department. They thanked him for his continued support and shared that they had implemented additional training measures and were considering further improvements. It wasn't just about keeping customers happy. It was about building trust and respect in a way that would ensure fairness for all passengers, regardless of their background. David smiled as he hung up the phone. He had made a difference. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, but it was happening. He knew this was just the beginning of a long journey. He would keep pushing for fairness, not just for himself, but for everyone. And as he looked at his family, he felt even more determined to continue the fight for a better, more respectful world. The weeks that followed were busy, but David felt a new sense of purpose. His work with the airline and his efforts to address unfair treatment in everyday life had ignited something inside him. It was no longer just about one flight attendant's mistake. It was about challenging the way people were treated based on their appearance and pushing for change on a broader scale. David found himself getting more involved in local community groups, speaking at events about his experience and the importance of standing up for what's right. His story resonated with many people who had faced similar situations, and it gave them the courage to speak out too. Slowly, but surely, David was beginning to see a shift in his community. One evening, David was invited to a town hall meeting to talk about fairness and inclusion in public spaces. As he stood in front of the group, he could feel the weight of his words. He wasn't just sharing his own experience. He was speaking for all the people who had been overlooked, ignored, or mistreated because of who they were. As a society, David began, his voice steady but passionate. We cannot continue to let biases shape our interactions with others. We all deserve respect, no matter where we come from or what we look like. The audience listened closely, nodding in agreement. David's story had touched a nerve, and he could see the impact of his words on the faces of those in the crowd. They were thinking, questioning, and reflecting on their own actions and the ways they could contribute to positive change. David continued, "When we see something wrong, we can't stay silent. We have to speak up, not just for ourselves, but for those who don't have a voice. Together, we can make a difference." After the meeting, several people approached David to thank him for sharing his story. They told him how his words had inspired them to take action in their own lives. Some even mentioned the positive changes they had noticed in their workplaces or communities since starting to challenge discriminatory behavior. David felt proud. He had no idea that one incident on a plane could lead to so much change. He wasn't just fighting for his own rights anymore. He was part of a larger movement for equality and respect. As the months passed, David continued to work with the airline to ensure they followed through on their promises. He also helped organize community outreach programs that educated people on how to be more aware of their biases and how to treat others with kindness and respect. It was a lot of work, but David was determined to make sure his efforts were part of something bigger than just one change. One day, David received a letter from the airline, thanking him once again for his feedback and contributions. They shared how they had implemented even more improvements in their customer service training and how they were committed to ongoing reviews. It wasn't a perfect system, but David could see that real progress was being made. Sitting at home with Claire and the kids, David smiled. He had come a long way since the flight, and though the journey had been difficult, he knew it had been worth it. Change didn't happen overnight, but with every step, they were making the world a little better for the next generation. Claire squeezed his hand. "You've done something amazing, David. You've made a difference." David looked at his family, feeling proud and fulfilled. "We've done it together," he said softly. "And we'll keep doing it, one step at a time."